Keith Raniere. On October 27, 2020, Keith Raniere stood in a Brooklyn courtroom as a judge handed down a 120-year prison sentence, marking the fall of a man who had spent decades building what appeared to be a legitimate self-help empire. The founder of NXIVM, a company that attracted thousands through expensive personal development seminars, had been exposed as the architect of something far darker. Raniere launched NXIVM in 1998 in Albany, New York, marketing executive success programs that charged participants thousands of dollars for supposed breakthroughs in human potential. The organization grew rapidly, generating millions as celebrities and professionals signed up for courses. But beneath the surface of workshops and self-improvement rhetoric, Raniere created DOS, a secret society where women became slaves to masters in a pyramid structure with him at the top. What drove this man to exploit those who trusted him? The DOS system operated through blackmail and manipulation. Women provided collateral, including compromising photographs and damaging confessions, believing this material would secure their commitment to personal growth. Instead, Raniere used these materials to coerce women into intimate relationships, branding them with a symbol that combined his initials, KR, and those of high-ranking member Allison Mack, AM, using a cauterizing pen in painful ceremonies masked as empowerment rituals. The physical marks became permanent symbols of his control. Raniere's exploitation extended beyond adult women. Court documents revealed he had groomed individuals before they reached adulthood, manipulating their development and trust. Witness testimony described calculated patterns of isolation, where Raniere separated targets from family and friends, replacing those connections with absolute dependence on him and NXIVM's structure. The organization's unraveling began with a 2017 New York Times investigation that revealed the branding ceremonies and coercive practices. Former members spoke publicly about their experiences, triggering FBI scrutiny. When authorities closed in, Raniere fled to Mexico, where he was arrested in March 2018 at a luxury villa outside Puerto Vallarta. His 2019 trial featured devastating testimony from survivors. One witness, identified as Daniela, described how Raniere manipulated her family's immigration status to maintain control. Another recounted being confined to a room for nearly 2 years as punishment for showing interest in another man. The evidence painted a picture of systematic psychological torture dressed up as spiritual awakening. Prosecutors presented recordings, emails, and financial records showing how Raniere extracted both money and compliance from his followers. He lived lavishly while preaching detachment from material concerns, maintaining multiple intimate relationships while demanding exclusivity from others. The jury convicted him on all counts: racketeering, forced labor conspiracy, and other charges related to exploitation. At sentencing, Judge Nicholas Garaufis rejected defense arguments blaming media bias or claiming consensual relationships. The court imposed 120 years plus a $1.75 million fine, effectively a life sentence for the 60-year-old. Victim impact statements described lasting trauma, with one survivor stating he should remain imprisoned for the immeasurable damages caused to countless lives. Raniere maintains his innocence from federal prison, filing appeals that courts have consistently denied. His organization collapsed completely, its properties sold, its teachings discredited. Former high-ranking members like Allison Mack received their own prison sentences for participating in recruitment and maintenance of the coercive system. But this was just one man's twisted vision of power disguised as enlightenment. Victor Barnard. In remote northern Minnesota, Victor Barnard created what he called the River Road Fellowship during the 1990s, isolating followers in a wooded compound far from outside scrutiny. The self-proclaimed prophet told his congregation he spoke directly with God, using that claimed authority to establish absolute control over every aspect of their lives. Barnard developed a theology that positioned him as Christ in the flesh, declaring that certain young women in the community were chosen as maidens who would serve him personally. He selected 10 individuals, specifically firstborn daughters from member families, telling parents this was divine appointment. These young people, ranging from adolescence to their early 20s, were separated into a special residence where Barnard had unrestricted access. How did families accept such arrangements? The fellowship operated on complete faith in Barnard's spiritual authority. He taught that questioning him meant questioning God, and that any disclosure of the maiden's activities would result in eternal consequences. Barnard warned these young women that speaking about their experiences would bring divine punishment upon themselves and their families. This theological manipulation kept the system functioning for years. Inside the maiden's residence, Barnard maintained what he described as a holy mission. The young women were told their service was necessary for spiritual purposes, with Barnard presenting his actions as religious obligations rather than personal desires. The isolation of the compound meant limited contact with anyone outside the fellowship who might have questioned the arrangement. The first cracks in Barnard's control appeared between 2009 and 2010 when concerns reached authorities, but victims didn't come forward publicly until 2012. Lindsay Tornambe, one of the survivors, eventually spoke to investigators, describing years of exploitation masked as spiritual duty. Her testimony revealed the psychological mechanisms Barnard used to maintain silence and compliance. "Victor told me that if I told anyone, I would receive eternal consequences from God," Tornambe later recounted in interviews. The religious framework he constructed made escape feel impossible, with victims believing they were protecting their families from divine wrath by enduring the situation. When charges were filed, Barnard fled Minnesota. He moved first to Washington State, where he was located but not arrested in 2014, then escaped to Brazil in an attempt to avoid prosecution. Brazilian authorities arrested him in 2015 after a lengthy international manhunt, and he was extradited back to Minnesota to face 59 counts related to his exploitation of the maidens. Rather than face trial on all charges, Barnard pleaded guilty in 2016 to 2 counts, receiving a 30-year sentence. He later successfully appealed to reduce this to 20 years, meaning potential release while still in his 60s. The plea agreement spared victims from testifying in detail about their experiences, though many expressed frustration that the sentence didn't reflect the years of harm. The River Road Fellowship dissolved after Barnard's arrest. Former members struggled to rebuild lives spent in isolation, with many requiring extensive counseling to process the religious manipulation they had experienced. Barnard remains incarcerated in Minnesota, his release date dependent on good behavior and successful completion of treatment programs. While one predator hid behind religion in rural America, another built his kingdom of terror in the Canadian wilderness. Roch Thériault. Roch Thériault founded the Ant Hill Kids Commune in 1977, blending Seventh-day Adventist teachings with apocalyptic prophecies in rural Quebec. He convinced followers that society would collapse imminently, and only those under his protection would survive the coming judgment. Thériault renamed himself Moise, claiming to be God's chosen prophet with authority over life and death. The commune operated as Thériault's personal kingdom, where approximately 12 adults and their offspring lived under his absolute rule. He established himself as the sole interpreter of divine will, making every decision from daily schedules to medical treatments. Thériault fathered 26 offspring with multiple women in the community, treating them as possessions rather than partners or children. What turned spiritual leadership into systematic torture? Thériault's methods for maintaining control grew increasingly violent. He performed crude surgical procedures without medical training, claiming divine guidance. When follower Solange Boilard complained of stomach pain, Thériault performed an amateur operation, removing part of her intestines with his hands, She perished from the procedure, but members were too terrified to report the incident to authorities. Punishments in the commune escalated from psychological manipulation to physical mutilation. Thériault used hammers, pliers, and knives to enforce discipline for perceived spiritual failings. One follower, Gabrielle Lavallee, suffered amputation of her arm after Thériault decided she needed purification through suffering. He performed the procedure himself, without anesthesia or proper tools. The isolation of the commune enabled these horrors to continue. Located in remote areas, first in Quebec, then moving to Burnt River, Ontario, and later to the Gaspa Peninsula in Quebec, the group had minimal contact with outsiders. Thériault taught that external society was corrupt and that leaving the commune meant spiritual death. This religious framework trapped followers even as violence became routine. Thériault's control extended to the youngest members of the community. When a small boy named Samuel Girard was deemed disobedient, Thériault beat him severely, resulting in fatal injuries. Rather than seek medical help, Thériault buried the body on commune property, telling members this was God's judgment on the faithless. The end came through Gabrielle Lavallee's courage. In 1989, after years of torture, including the loss of her arm, she escaped and went to authorities. She showed police her injuries and described the commune's horrors in detail. Her testimony led to Thériault's arrest for assault, exposing the full scope of activities at the Ant Hill Kids. Initial charges focused on assault, earning Thériault a 12-year sentence. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered evidence of Solange Boilard's death. Thériault was subsequently convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Even behind bars, his grandiose delusions persisted, with Thériault maintaining he had been fulfilling God's plan. His story ended violently. In 2011, another inmate ended Thériault's life in prison, stabbing him repeatedly. The man who had claimed divine authority and inflicted decades of suffering died at 63, leaving behind traumatized survivors still processing their experiences. The commune disbanded after his arrest. Some former members struggled to reintegrate into society after years of isolation and indoctrination. From the frozen Canadian wilderness to the heart of Jerusalem, another leader twisted faith into chains. Daniel Ambash. In Jerusalem's ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, Daniel Ambash constructed a household that outsiders saw as religiously devout, but that functioned as a prison for those inside. A follower of Bratslav Hasidism, Ambash established a polygamous family with 6 wives and dozens of children. Official reports cited between 14 and 17 children lived in the home at the time of the raid, though some estimates of his total offspring are higher. Claiming this arrangement followed divine commandment and ancient spiritual practices, behind closed doors, Ambash's religious justifications masked systematic exploitation and control. He confined family members to their Jerusalem home, limiting contact with the outside world, and establishing himself as the sole authority on all matters. Ambash created an environment where questioning his decisions meant spiritual rebellion, punishable through various means. What methods did he use to maintain this hidden kingdom? The household operated under strict rules enforced through psychological and physical means. Ambash taught that his wives and offspring existed to serve his spiritual mission, framing any resistance as failure in religious duty. When discipline was required, he employed techniques designed to terrorize without leaving obvious marks, including suffocation methods and forced nakedness as punishment. Court documents later revealed that Ambash had exploited multiple family members over years, using his position as patriarch to justify actions he described as religiously necessary. He manipulated interpretations of Jewish law to support his authority, creating a twisted theology that placed him beyond accountability. The isolation of the household meant victims had no access to outside perspectives that might challenge Ambash's teachings. Financial control reinforced his power. Ambush managed all household resources, leaving wives and offspring completely dependent on him for basic needs. Some reports suggested the family survived partly through begging, with Ambush positioning this as humble religious practice rather than economic exploitation of those he controlled. The concealment began to crack in 2011 when one of Ambush's wives contacted authorities, describing the conditions inside the household. Her report triggered an investigation that uncovered the full scope of what prosecutors would later describe as enslavement. Police interviews with family members revealed patterns of harm extending back years. How did investigators build their case against such a secretive household? Evidence came from medical examinations, testimonies from multiple family members, and documentation of the household's isolation. Authorities charged Ambush with 18 separate offenses, including serious violations that painted a picture of sustained exploitation disguised as religious devotion. The trial exposed how he had used spiritual authority to justify controlling every aspect of family members' lives. During proceedings, Ambush maintained that his household followed authentic religious practices and that any difficulties were misunderstood by secular authorities. His defense argued that the court was interfering with legitimate religious freedom, attempting to frame the prosecution as persecution of ultra-Orthodox lifestyles rather than accountability for documented harm. The court rejected these arguments, convicting Ambush in 2013 on multiple counts and sentencing him to 26 years in prison. The verdict acknowledged that while religious communities have freedom to practice their beliefs, this freedom does not extend to exploitation and harm of family members. Judges noted the particularly vulnerable position of those trapped in Ambush's household. Testimony included devastating details about daily life under his control. One witness described how Ambush framed harmful actions as part of her duty in family life, using religious language to normalize unacceptable behavior. The psychological manipulation was as damaging as physical harm, leaving victims struggling to recognize their experiences as exploitation rather than spiritual service. Ambush died in prison on May 24, 2022, having served less than 10 years of his sentence. His passing came before some family members felt ready to process their experiences publicly. While religious extremism enabled one man's crimes in Jerusalem, an entirely different ideology would fuel murders in California. Charles Manson. Charles Manson never personally committed the 1969 murders that made him infamous, but he orchestrated them through followers who treated his words as divine command. The leader of what became known as the Manson family had spent years building a commune in the California desert, attracting young people searching for meaning in the chaotic landscape of late 1960s America. Manson's ideology centered on an apocalyptic race war he called Helter Skelter, a term borrowed from a Beatles song he believed contained hidden messages about societal collapse. He taught his followers that violent acts would trigger this conflict, after which the family would emerge to rule over the ruins. This bizarre belief system mixed white supremacist ideology with distorted religious concepts and drug-fueled mysticism. What drove comfortable middle-class youth to commit murder for this vision? Manson's control techniques involved isolation, sleep deprivation, drugs, and constant indoctrination at the family's ranch hideout. He positioned himself as a messianic figure with supernatural insight, claiming to see the future and understand cosmic truths hidden from ordinary people. Young followers, many searching for alternative lifestyles during the counterculture era, found themselves trapped in his psychological web. The violence began in July 1969 with the slaying of Gary Hinman, a music teacher and chemist, who Manson believed had inherited money or held a formula for drugs. But the murders that shocked the nation occurred in August. On August 8th to 9, family members broke into the home of actress Sharon Tate, killing her and 4 others in a savage attack that left the word pig written in Sharon Tate's blood on the front door. The following night, they killed Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, leaving messages in blood including "death to pigs," "rise," and "helter-skelter" misspelled on the walls and refrigerator. The brutality was calculated to appear random and terrifying, designed to spark the racial apocalypse Manson predicted. Family members later testified they believed they were starting a revolution, following Manson's instructions to make it as gruesome as you can. The disconnect between their ordinary appearances and the violence they committed shocked investigators and the public. Law enforcement initially struggled to connect the crimes. The breakthrough came when Susan Atkins, one of the participants, confessed details to a cellmate while jailed on unrelated charges. Her account linked the murders to Manson's desert commune and revealed the ideological motivations behind the seemingly senseless violence. Manson and key family members were arrested in late 1969 during a raid on the ranch for suspected auto theft. Once the connection to the murders emerged, prosecutors built a case showing how Manson maintained absolute control over his followers and directed the violence while remaining physically distant from the crimes themselves. The trial began in 1970, becoming a media spectacle as Manson and his co-defendants disrupted proceedings with bizarre outbursts and theatrical behavior. Manson carved an X into his forehead, which he later changed to a swastika, and made rambling statements, mixing spiritual proclamations with threats. "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business," he reportedly said, embracing his dark reputation. Prosecutors presented testimony from former family members who described the commune's dynamics and Manson's psychological control. The jury heard about the ideology, the drugs, the isolation, and the gradual escalation that made murder seem like revolutionary action. In 1971, Manson and 3 co-defendants received death sentences, though these were commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished capital punishment. Manson spent the rest of his life in prison, giving occasional interviews where he denied responsibility while simultaneously taking credit for influencing events. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood prophet whose followers acted independently, though trial evidence clearly showed his orchestrating role. Manson died in prison in November 2017 at age 82, having been denied parole 12 times. Unlike Manson's small desert commune, the next case involved a massive organization with international reach. Shoko Asahara. Shoko Asahara founded Aum Shinrikyo in 1984, transforming a yoga and meditation group into a doomsday cult with thousands of members across Japan and internationally. The partially blind guru born Chizuo Matsumoto claimed he could levitate and see the future, attracting educated professionals and young seekers to his blend of Buddhism, Hinduism, and apocalyptic prophecies. By the early 1990s, Asahara's teachings had grown increasingly dark. He predicted Armageddon would arrive by 1997, with only Aum members surviving the global catastrophe. This doomsday timeline justified increasingly extreme measures, as Asahara convinced followers that ordinary morality didn't apply when preparing for the world's end. Why did educated people follow someone with such extreme claims? Aum Shinrikyo offered something appealing to disillusioned youth in materialistic 1990s Japan: a sense of purpose and spiritual advancement through intensive practices. The organization operated legal businesses, published magazines, and attracted members from universities and professional careers. Asahara positioned Aum as humanity's salvation, himself as the enlightened master who would guide the worthy through apocalypse. But behind meditation and scripture study, Asahara built a criminal empire. The cult manufactured weapons, including automatic rifles, and worked on developing biological and chemical agents. When former members tried to leave or critics investigated the organization, they disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The murders included lawyer Tsutsumi Sakamoto, his wife, and their young son in 1989, killed to silence investigation into the cult. The violence escalated beyond targeted murders. In June 1994, Aum released sarin nerve gas in Matsumoto, killing 8 people and sickening hundreds in what appeared to be a test run of their chemical capabilities. The attack went unsolved for months, allowing Asahara to plan an even larger assault. On March 20, 1995, Aum members released sarin gas on 5 Tokyo subway trains, killing 14 people and injuring over 6,000 people in one of the worst terrorist incidents in Japanese history. Victims experienced horrific symptoms as the nerve agent spread through crowded stations, while attackers calmly exited the trains and fled. The subway attack shocked Japan and prompted immediate investigation. Police had already suspected Aum's involvement in previous incidents, and evidence quickly pointed to the organization. Raids on Aum facilities uncovered chemical weapons production equipment, laboratories, and evidence connecting the group to multiple crimes. Asahara went into hiding in the complex of Aum's main compound, but authorities found him in May 1995 concealed in a small space filled with cash. His arrest began a lengthy legal process that would examine the full scope of Aum's criminal activities, from murder to weapons production to financial fraud. During his trial, which lasted years, prosecutors presented evidence of Asahara's direct involvement in planning and ordering the attacks. Former cult members testified about the organization's inner workings and Asahara's absolute authority. He claimed he was Jesus Christ reincarnated and that his actions served higher spiritual purposes, but courts rejected these religious justifications. The evidence showed Asahara had funded his vision through aggressive recruitment and exploitation of members who donated money, worked without pay in Aum businesses, and purchased expensive spiritual training programs. The organization had accumulated significant wealth through these methods, which funded both legitimate operations and weapons development. In 2004, Asahara received a death sentence. On July 6, 2018, he was executed along with 6 other senior Aum members, followed by the remaining 6 members on July 26, 2018, a total of 13 executions that month. The cult officially changed its name and disavowed Asahara's teachings, though splinter groups continue to operate under government surveillance. Victims of the subway attack still suffer health effects from sarin exposure, and Japan strengthened laws governing religious organizations in response to Aum's crimes. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Across the ocean in America, another leader wrapped exploitation in religious garments. Tony Alamo. Tony Alamo built an evangelical empire from the streets of Hollywood. But behind the ministry's facade of saving souls lay decades of exploitation hidden in plain sight. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1934, some records suggest September 20th, 1934, he reinvented himself as a charismatic preacher who, alongside his wife Edith Cherie Oppenstein, who took the name Susan Alamo, founded the ministry in 1969. The organization grew into a multi-million-dollar operation with businesses, properties, and followers across multiple states. The ministry operated commercial ventures, including clothing manufacturing, gas stations, and retail stores, generating significant revenue while relying on unpaid labor from congregation members. Alamo lived lavishly with expensive cars and properties, preaching prosperity gospel while followers worked long hours for no wages, told their labor served God's kingdom. What allowed this street preacher to build such an empire? Alamo's theological teachings positioned him as God's chosen messenger with unique authority to interpret Scripture. After Susan's passing in 1982, his doctrines became increasingly extreme. He claimed Susan would be resurrected, and kept her body on display in a heart-shaped, glass-topped casket for 6 months, insisting she would return to life. When this didn't occur, Alamo's teachings shifted toward justifications for practices that would eventually lead to his downfall. By the 1990s and 2000s, Alamo had established a pattern of taking young brides, claiming biblical precedent for marriages to individuals far below legal age. He taught that females matured faster spiritually and that early marriage protected them from worldly corruption. These theological distortions allowed him to exploit his position of religious authority within the insular community. The ministry's structure isolated members from outside influence. Families lived on church properties, were homeschooled with ministry-approved materials, and questioning Alamo's authority meant spiritual rebellion. This environment enabled patterns of harm to continue for years without intervention, as victims had no framework for understanding their experiences as exploitation rather than religious duty. Former members began speaking out in the 2000s, describing the conditions inside Alamo's ministry. Their testimonies revealed a system where Alamo selected young brides from congregation families, using his spiritual authority to overcome any resistance from parents or the individuals themselves. He framed these arrangements as divinely ordained, making refusal appear as disobedience to God. The FBI investigation intensified after multiple former members provided detailed accounts of the ministry's practices. Agents conducted raids on Alamo's properties in Arkansas and other states, gathering evidence of the organizational structure that facilitated his crimes. The investigation revealed how Alamo transported individuals across state lines, a federal offense that provided jurisdiction for prosecution. In 2009, Alamo faced trial on charges related to transporting individuals for illegal purposes. The proceedings featured testimony from multiple victims who described being forced into marriages while still in their early years. Their accounts painted a picture of exploitation dressed up as religious practice. Throughout the trial, Alamo maintained his innocence, claiming persecution by a government hostile to true Christianity. He characterized the charges as attacks on religious freedom and portrayed himself as a martyr suffering for his faith. The jury rejected these arguments, hearing instead the voices of those he had harmed behind theological justifications. The court sentenced Alamo to 175 years in federal prison, consecutive 10-year terms for each of the 10 counts of the Mann Act, plus additional time, effectively ensuring he would never be released. The lengthy sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the extended period over which the exploitation occurred. Federal authorities also seized ministry properties and assets, dismantling the financial empire Alamo had built. He died in May 2017 while incarcerated in North Carolina, still insisting he had been wrongly convicted for practicing his religious beliefs. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Turkey, another man used religion for different purposes. Adnan Oktar. In Istanbul, Adnan Oktar presented himself as an Islamic scholar and creationist, hosting lavish television programs featuring young women in glamorous clothing and makeup while he discussed religious topics. Known by his pen name Harun Yahya, Oktar built a media empire starting in the 1990s that broadcast across Turkey and internationally, mixing discussions of faith with a lifestyle that seemed to contradict conservative religious values. Oktar's organization published hundreds of books and distributed materials promoting creationism and criticizing evolutionary theory. His media presence grew elaborate, with production values rivaling commercial entertainment programs. The young women appearing on his shows, whom he called kittens, wore designer clothes and heavy makeup while Oktar held court as a spiritual teacher. What was really happening behind the cameras and polished productions? Turkish authorities had investigated Oktar's organization multiple times over decades, with allegations surfacing periodically about conditions inside his compound. Former members described a system where Oktar maintained absolute control through psychological manipulation, presenting his lifestyle as spiritually advanced while exploiting those around him for his personal benefit. The organization operated through a combination of media revenue, book sales, and donations from followers who believed in Akhtar's religious mission. He lived in luxury while maintaining tight control over members' lives, dictating their appearances, relationships, and daily activities. The television broadcasts served dual purposes, spreading his religious message and displaying his power and wealth. Akhtar's theological teachings mixed Islamic concepts with his own interpretations that conveniently justified his lifestyle. He claimed special spiritual insight that allowed him to see truths hidden from ordinary believers. This positioning made questioning him appear as faithlessness, creating psychological barriers that kept members compliant even when they felt uncomfortable with organizational practices. In July 2018, Turkish police raided Akhtar's compound, arresting him along with dozens of associates in a coordinated operation. The raid came after years of accumulating evidence and testimony from former members who had found the courage to speak about their experiences inside the organization. The charges were extensive and serious. Prosecutors accused Akhtar of leading a criminal organization, various forms of exploitation, political espionage, and fraud. The indictment described a system where he used religious authority and media influence to control members and exploit them for personal gratification and financial gain. During the trial, which lasted several years, hundreds of witnesses testified about conditions inside Akhtar's organization. Former members described how he selected certain women for special attention, using theological arguments to justify arrangements that served his desires rather than any legitimate religious purpose. The evidence revealed psychological manipulation techniques designed to break down individual autonomy. In January 2021, an Istanbul court sentenced Akhtar to 1,075 years in prison on multiple counts. This sentence was later increased on appeal in 2022 to 8,658 years total, reflecting the massive scale of the criminal enterprise and the number of victims involved. The lengthy sentence reflected the numerous victims and the extended period over which the crimes occurred. Throughout the proceedings, Akhtar maintained his innocence, characterizing the charges as persecution by enemies of his religious work. He claimed his organization represented true Islam and that the women appeared on his programs voluntarily, choosing their appearances and participation freely. The courts rejected these arguments based on witness testimony and evidence of control mechanisms. Former members described a gradual process of isolation and indoctrination. New recruits were drawn by Akhtar's media presence and religious teachings, initially seeing the organization as a spiritual community. Over time, control increased through psychological manipulation, with members separated from family and outside contacts, while being taught that Akhtar represented their only path to spiritual truth. But perhaps no modern religious leader exploited more people over a longer period than the next case. Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs inherited leadership of the FLDS in September 2002 following the death of his father, Rulon Jeffs, who was 92 at the time, taking control of a community of approximately 10,000 followers living primarily in twin towns straddling the Utah-Arizona border. The FLDS had split from mainstream Mormonism over polygamy, maintaining 19th century traditions the larger church had abandoned. Under Jeffs' leadership, the insular community became increasingly isolated and controlled. He established himself as the sole prophet authorized to speak for God, making all decisions for community members, including housing, jobs, and critically, marriage arrangements. Jeffs taught that his authority came directly from divine revelation and that obedience to him meant obedience to God. What drove this religious leader to such extreme control? Jeffs' theology centered on celestial marriage, where men needed multiple wives to achieve the highest level of heaven. As prophet, he claimed exclusive authority to arrange these marriages. The marriage assignments included unions between adult men and young individuals far below legal age. Jeffs personally performed ceremonies joining grown men to those as young as 12 or 13, claiming divine instruction. The FLDS community's isolation enabled these practices to continue. Members lived in closed compounds, attended church-run schools, and contact with outside society was minimal. Jeffs taught that the outside world was corrupt and that exposure to mainstream culture would destroy spiritual purity. The breakthrough came as former FLDS members began speaking publicly about conditions inside the church. Their testimonies described forced marriages and exploitation through the marriage system. In 2006, Jeffs was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list and fled to avoid prosecution. He was captured during a traffic stop in Nevada later that year. Texas authorities raided the YFZ, Yearning for Zion Ranch, in April 2008, removing 441 children and several hundred women during the initial operation. The raid uncovered documentation of marriages involving very young brides and other evidence of violations of laws protecting minors. Jeffs' Texas trial in 2011 featured audio recordings where his voice could be heard performing marriage ceremonies and providing instructions to young brides. DNA testing confirmed Jeffs had fathered offspring with individuals who had been underage at conception. Records showed a pattern of marriages arranged between adult men and young individuals, all orchestrated by Jeffs. In August 2011, Jeffs was convicted of 2 counts of assault and received a sentence of life in prison for 1 count and 20 years for the other, to be served consecutively. Even from prison, Jeffs continued to lead the FLDS through letters and phone calls, issuing edicts that followers treated as divine revelation. From religious extremism to something entirely different, pseudoscience exploiting grief. Grigory Grabovoy. Grigory Grabovoy emerged in Russia during the 1990s as a self-proclaimed clairvoyant and healer, claiming he could resurrect the deceased through special numerical sequences and consciousness techniques. Born in Kazakhstan in 1963, he positioned himself as a scientist with supernatural abilities, blending pseudoscientific language with metaphysical claims to attract followers seeking solutions to life's hardest problems. Grabovoy's teachings centered on the idea that reality could be manipulated through focused consciousness and specific number sequences. He claimed to have advanced degrees and scientific credentials, though these claims were disputed. His materials promised not just healing, but actual resurrection of the deceased, appealing to those desperate with grief. How could such impossible claims gain followers? The collapse of the Soviet Union created social instability and spiritual seeking in Russia. Traditional structures had failed, and people searched for alternative answers to suffering. Grabovoy offered hope where conventional help had ended, promising that death itself could be reversed through his techniques. His opportunity for widespread attention came through tragedy. In September 2004, terrorists seized a school in Beslan, North Ossetia, holding hundreds hostage. The crisis ended in catastrophe with explosions and gunfire that killed 334 people, including 186 students. The incident traumatized Russia, leaving parents devastated. Grabovoy saw an opportunity. He approached grieving parents with an appalling proposal. He would resurrect their deceased offspring for fees of 40,000 to 60,000 rubles, approximately $1,500 to $2,000 at the time. He claimed his consciousness techniques could bring back the lost lives, offering desperate parents hope in their darkest moment. Grabovoy produced no actual resurrections, instead offering complex explanations involving quantum mechanics, consciousness fields, and number sequences that supposedly worked on timelines invisible to ordinary perception. His pseudoscientific language gave his claims a veneer of legitimacy to those unfamiliar with actual scientific principles. The exploitation of Beslan parents' grief sparked outrage. Mothers of victims filed complaints, leading to Grabovoy's arrest in 2006 on fraud charges. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence of the payments Grabovoy had collected and the promises he had made, demonstrating that his claims of scientific credentials were exaggerated or false. In 2008, a Russian court convicted Grabovoy of fraud and sentenced him to 11 years in prison, which was later reduced to 8 years on appeal. Grabovoy was granted early release for good behavior in April 2010 after serving roughly 2 years of his sentence, despite the 8-year term. After his release, Grabovoy continued promoting his teachings, though with less public prominence. He maintained websites selling books, courses, and devices supposedly based on his consciousness techniques. The Beslan Mothers Organization continued speaking out against Grabovoy, warning others about his exploitation of their tragedy. While Grabovoy claimed supernatural powers, another man in Israel wielded control through different means. Goel Ratzon. In Tel Aviv, Goel Ratzon maintained a household with dozens of women who treated him as a messianic figure, tattooing his name and image on their bodies and bearing his 89 children, the official number cited during the investigation, while he lived as their absolute master. The case shocked Israel when authorities uncovered the scope of his control over women who lived in poverty while serving his every desire. Ratzon, whose name translates to Redeemer of Will, Goel = Redeemer, Ratzon = Will, Desire, positioned himself as a spiritual figure with special powers and divine authority. He convinced women that he possessed supernatural abilities, and that serving him offered spiritual elevation. The women in his household numbered over 30 at various times, living in cramped apartments while competing for his attention and approval. How did so many women become trapped in this arrangement? Ratzon targeted vulnerable women, often those dealing with difficult life circumstances or searching for meaning and connection. He presented himself as offering protection and spiritual guidance, gradually increasing control through psychological manipulation. The women were isolated from outside relationships and taught that Ratzon represented their only path to fulfillment. The household operated under strict rules with Ratzon as absolute authority. Women worked to support him financially while he contributed nothing, living off their labor and government benefits they collected. He rotated between apartments where different groups of women lived, maintaining relationships with multiple women while demanding exclusive devotion in return. The women bore his offspring, with Ratzon fathering dozens through various relationships in the household. The living conditions were cramped and difficult, with multiple women and offspring sharing small spaces while resources went to supporting Ratzon's lifestyle. Physical markers of his control included tattoos. Women in the household had Ratzon's name, face, or the phrase "Goals Girl" tattooed on their bodies, permanent marks of their belonging to him. These tattoos served as both symbols of devotion and mechanisms of control. In 2009, concerns from social workers and complaints from family members prompted police investigation. When officers entered the apartments, they found conditions that raised immediate concerns about exploitation and psychological manipulation. The investigation revealed the full scope of Ratzon's control. Ratzon was arrested in 2010 on multiple charges related to the women in his household. The trial featured testimony from some women who had left the household and gained perspective on their experiences. They described how Ratzon had gradually isolated them, broken down their self-worth, and created psychological dependence that made leaving feel impossible. In 2014, an Israeli court convicted Ratzon on multiple counts and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. The verdict acknowledged that while some women claimed consensual participation, the evidence showed psychological manipulation that negated genuine consent. Throughout the proceedings, Ratson maintained that all relationships in his household were consensual. While Ratson claimed spiritual authority in Israel, another leader in London used political ideology to justify his crimes. Aravindan Balakrishnan. In South London, Aravindan Balakrishnan operated a Maoist commune for over 30 years, holding women in psychological captivity while claiming to lead a revolutionary vanguard against capitalist oppression. Known as Comrade Bala, he created an isolated world where followers believed he possessed godlike powers and that the outside world threatened their lives. Balakrishnan had arrived in Britain from Singapore in 1963, though he was of Indian descent, becoming involved in far-left political movements. He founded the Workers' Institute of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought, attracting followers who believed in revolutionary change. Over time, the political organization transformed into an isolated commune dominated by his personality cult. The commune operated behind closed doors in various London addresses, with members forbidden from leaving or having outside contacts. Balakrishnan taught that he was the dear leader of a revolutionary cell, and that invisible fascist forces constantly threatened to eliminate them. This paranoia kept followers isolated and dependent on him for protection from imaginary enemies. What methods did he use to maintain such control for decades? Balakrishnan employed psychological torture, including sleep deprivation, verbal degradation, and physical harm, breaking down followers' sense of self until they existed only to serve his will. He claimed supernatural abilities, including reading minds and controlling events through mental powers, making resistance seem futile. The most disturbing aspect involved his own daughter, who was born in the commune and kept hidden from authorities for 30 years. She grew up believing Balakrishnan possessed godlike powers, and that venturing outside meant certain danger. Her entire reality was shaped by his delusions and lies. The young woman, Katie Morgan Davies, never attended school, had no friends, and did not even know her mother, another commune member, was her mother until after the escape. Other women in the commune endured similar psychological captivity, with Balakrishnan exploiting them while positioning himself as their protector and revolutionary leader. He used political ideology to justify his behavior, claiming that conventional morality was bourgeois. In 2013, a charity called Freedom received a call from someone in the commune, leading to police investigation and raid on the addresses where Balakrishnan held his followers. Officers found the women living in conditions of psychological imprisonment, with his daughter particularly affected after 3 decades of captivity. During his 2015 to 2016 trial, the court heard extensive testimony about life in the commune. Balakrishnan's daughter described believing her father could read her thoughts and harm her through mental powers, explaining why escape seemed impossible despite no physical restraints. In 2016, Balakrishnan was convicted and sentenced to 23 years in prison for various offenses against the women. Balakrishnan died in prison in March 2022 at age 81, having served only part of his sentence. His daughter spoke publicly about experiencing freedom for the first time in her 30s, learning to navigate a world she had been taught to fear. The final case brings us to an American university where manipulation took a different form. Larry Ray. In September 2010, Larry Ray moved into Slonim Woods 9, a student townhouse at Sarah Lawrence College after being released from prison. What began as a father staying with his daughter after release from prison evolved into years of psychological manipulation and exploitation of her roommates and friends that would eventually lead to federal charges. Ray, born in 1959 in Brooklyn, had a background that included work as an informant and various legal troubles. He presented himself to the college students as a sophisticated, worldly figure with connections to powerful people and insights into psychology and human nature. The young people, searching for meaning and mentorship, were drawn to his confident persona. Initially, Ray positioned himself as offering therapy-like conversations, helping the students understand their psychological issues and family dynamics. These sessions took place in the dorm and later in apartments, where some students moved with him. What seemed like helpful guidance gradually transformed into something far darker. How did a father figure become a controller and exploiter? Ray employed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques, convincing students they had wronged him in various ways and owed him restitution. He extracted false confessions to crimes they hadn't committed, created elaborate scenarios where students believed they had damaged him, and demanded compensation for these imaginary harms. The manipulation escalated into exploitation, with Ray forcing some victims to perform labor while he collected their earnings. He isolated victims from family and friends, moving them between apartments and controlling their communications. The young people, many of whom were sophomores at the time, found themselves trapped in Ray's psychological web, with some remaining under his control for nearly a decade after leaving the college. One victim, Claudia Drury, became particularly entangled. Ray convinced her she owed him money and forced her into situations where she would earn funds to repay this fictitious debt. Over years, she gave Ray approximately $2.5 million obtained through activities he directed, while he lived lavishly and maintained control through threats. The exploitation included physical harm, sleep deprivation, food restriction, and other tactics designed to break victims' will and autonomy. Ray recorded many of his interactions with victims, creating a disturbing archive that would later become evidence in his prosecution. In 2019, New York Magazine published an extensive investigation into Ray's activities at Sarah Lawrence, exposing the scope of his manipulation and exploitation. The article brought national attention to a case that had been developing in relative obscurity for nearly a decade. The publicity prompted FBI investigation, with agents interviewing victims and reviewing the extensive evidence Ray had created through his own recordings. Ray was arrested in February 2020 and charged with federal offenses, including forced labor and extortion. His trial in 2022 featured testimony from multiple victims describing the psychological techniques Ray used to gain and maintain control. In January 2023, Ray was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for the 63-year-old. The judge emphasized the calculated nature of his exploitation and the lasting harm to the young people he manipulated. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.